Hey there, my name is Sean, and you look like you could use some clickbait in your life during quarantine, which is perfect because today I am loosely using Python to help me identify the perfect games in my tiny little Xbox collection. So prepare to be underwhelmed by my findings and my lack of programming skills. I am just starting to learn Python programming, but I believe that demonstrating knowledge with small projects like this is a great way to learn, and it's a good excuse for a video too. So check the timestamps below because the first half of the video will be more about Python, and the latter half more about Xbox games. So a disclaimer, I take video game collecting very seriously, and by that I mean that I don't dedicate much money to collecting. I really want every little thing to count. I have very deliberate restrictions for my collecting, but I believe that creativity thrives on these constraints, and it's made my collection very special to me and very unique. I also enjoy analyzing and overthinking things almost as much as actually playing the video games, so it just feels right. Let's start with the Python program itself so that anyone only interested in my lack of programming skill doesn't have to watch the whole video. My program uses two code libraries to do most of the tricky stuff. One is called OpenPixel, it works with Excel files, while the other, called Matplotlib, does the charting. The program needs the Excel sheet name and a few other data points. My near future learning goal is to add a front end where it'll ask the user for this info when the program is opened. So I've kept those variables up here at the top of my code to make things easier when I get to that point. The bottom part of the code is actually what plots all the information, then shows the chart and saves an image of it. The bulk of the code here in the middle is actually just grabbing every single row of data for each of the 3 required columns in the spreadsheet and converting the information from tuples to lists, which is just because it's something I understand a little better within Python. As I learn, I will try to reduce some of this redundant, extra repetitive code. Here's a quick look at the sample spreadsheet I've been using. The columns I use are game title, price, and rating, and there are 3 tabs that matter. There's loose, complete, and wish list. All 3 have the exact same rows and columns format, just different information separated on different tabs. Finally, we run it, and we get this. It plots games based on ratings from Metacritic.com on the x-axis and prices from PriceCharting.com or VGPC.com on the y-axis. The mean, which is the average number, and the median, which is the middle number, are plotted there just for reference. In a small sample, the mean gets thrown off noticeably by outliers, so the median tends to be a little more interesting here in my opinion. You can see games are color-coded based on complete, loose, or wish list status. I typically plot each of these in separate charts to keep apples to apples, but I did want to show the program's full output first. So here's the chart containing only complete games, which I want to use to demonstrate one more point, pun intended. You'll notice this additional axis plotted in gray, and you can probably kind of guess what that is just by looking. I had a friend who is far better at statistics than I am explain cluster analysis to me, which I sort of understand in theory. My summary of Wikipedia's definition is grouping a set of objects in such a way that the objects in the same group or cluster are more similar to each other than to those in other clusters. It's really just finding meaningful groups within a scatter chart, so there could be many clusters, but after all of that complex statistical discussion, my naked, uneducated eyeballs broke this tiny dataset down into the hyper-simple trio you see here, with the extra gray axis just helping visualization. I know Metacritic and PriceCharting.com are not perfect. They are aggregators, they fluctuate all the time, they don't represent my opinions, but they are consistent and self-contained, so they're perfect for this. And again, I only drew those lines that look like quadrants because I don't know how to highlight a cluster in Python. The lines are at 65 on the Metacritic x-axis and 18 on the price charting y-axis, because this bottom right cluster is my foundation, it's my focus. The vast majority of my collection should be as relatively, that's an important word, should be as relatively cheap and good as possible. I want my shelves full of Grand Theft Autos, Halos, Splinter Cells, X-Men Legends. Anyone who owns an Xbox could get literal months of joy from like $100 worth of these games. I do think this main cluster does stretch a little too far into mediocrity for my taste. I like Enclave, for example, because I like high fantasy third-person RPGs, but stuff like Dakar, am I saying that right? Dakar 2, Silent Scope, Advent Rising, these aren't things that I would really recommend to anyone. But they are inexpensive, they add a little diversity to my shelf. I don't have any issue with owning those. That's fine. The bottom left cluster requires some evaluation. In my mind, that's like the collection chopping block. I really like action-adventure games like Azuric, but apparently it's bad, while Dead to Rights 2 and Stolen don't appeal to me, but they are so cheap that they're really only costing me a small slice of my shelf space. I actually haven't played any of these, but I will before our next local game swap meet, because if they interested somebody else and I could upgrade them to something more appealing to me, I probably would. The upper left cluster is empty, because I don't keep shitty games that have decent trade value. Finally, the top right cluster, Dead or Alive Beach Volleyball and House of the Dead 3 were the weirdest tweeners in the whole chart, in my opinion, but I don't care for fan service volleyball games or arcade rail shooters brought to home consoles, except for the Wii. Worked pretty well there. And both of these have some trade value, so they might be on their way out. I'll consider it. I do like having the diversity in my collection. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2 and KOTOR 2 are two of my absolute favorite games on the entire console, so in my mind, they are worth the asking price. They do look like outliers here, but they're worth it. Because, remember that we are looking at these as clusters, just logical groups. Big Xbox library picture, there are 1,100-ish US Xbox title listings on price charting, so that includes variants like the Platinum Hits version versus the regular version. There's about 1,100-ish of those. Only about 100 of those games cost more than KOTOR 2 or Dark Alliance 2. That means that tons and tons of games would probably fit in this big gap here if I had a bigger collection, and then those two wouldn't look so much like outliers. This is where it gets subjective. I think these are reasonable prices to pay for games this fun, because if you plot every game in the library in order of cost on a line chart, so on a curve, these two fall a little above where prices start to spike. That is, where the rate of the price increase from one game to the next game starts to go up at a disproportionate rate, which is around $20 that you can kind of see on this very basic chart I've plotted here. So being a cheapskate is great, and theoretically I do want the majority of my games to be in that good and cheap category, but every collector likes having things with value too. That's why, for price, I think the perfect collection games are near that price spike line, personally. For quality, I always want games to be as good as possible, but realistically, the absolute best games tend to sell a little more and therefore cost a little less, realistically. So this is it. It's the big reveal, the one you've been waiting for since you first laid eyes on my sellout video title. My perfect Xbox collection games are the ones that fall right around here. Exciting, right? I know. I can barely contain myself. This is a space where I think, relative to this library as a whole, the games in this space are always going to feel good and collectible. So KOTOR 2, the non-platinum one, is the closest thing I have. It sold well, but still far less than Halos and Fable and Grand Theft Autos that sold like gangbusters. It's highly praised in hindsight. It's iconic to the original Xbox and what Microsoft was trying to accomplish with PC ports on that console. It's kind of a common theme for some of the bigger games in my mind, at least. It's got a big license, so on and so forth. Tremendous game, really close to that kind of perfect collection game category. KOTOR 1 would be close too. It's a little cheaper, it would be close. It's docked for me because I am missing the manual. That's when I've got the case and the game, but no manual sadly, so it gets lumped in with the loose games. So that big gap where I don't actually have any games in this perfect space is very uninteresting. So let's go back to that chart where I add some loose games and my wishlist titles, and maybe that'll spice things up a little bit. My wishlist always trends cheap because it's usually full of stuff where I feel like there's no good reason I shouldn't own those games. They're so good, they're so cheap, they're so common. How have I not acquired in my travels Forza Motorsport or Grand Theft Auto San Andreas? But there are a couple things on there that are kind of close to this perfect sphere here. Ninja Gaiden Black, that's a really impressive title over there. I think I have the regular Ninja Gaiden, not Ninja Gaiden Black. Many people claim that Xbox has the best version of Tony Hawk 3, which I need to try because the PS2 version of Tony Hawk 3 is probably among my personal top 5 games of all time on any console, and I've never even tried the Xbox version of that game, so I should have that game. That's ridiculous. And finally, I mentioned that I love Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, so it feels like I really should own the first one. Really, I love Dark Alliance 2, and I've never even played one. I'm sure I'd love it too. I don't have much to say about loose games. Several have cases but no manuals, like KOTOR and The Incredible Hulk, which are both incredible games. Tecmo Arcade and Dragon Ball Z Sagas look really bad over there on the bottom left, but I love compilations, especially some of those old Tecmo games. It's not a great compilation, but I still love that disc. And I also am a sucker for Dragon Ball properties, or Dragon Warrior properties, Akira Toriyama stuff. Big sucker for that, so those aren't going anywhere. I haven't thought about criteria for loose games, but maybe somewhere near this disc-only Morrowind Game of the Year edition. If it were complete, it would price very close to KOTOR 2, and that's yet another awesome PC game brought very successfully to the Xbox. So maybe that Morrowind Game of the Year edition is pretty close to the perfect position for a loose disc. I don't know, didn't think about it much. And that is the anticlimactic end of this video. Pretty dramatic stuff, I know, pretty heavy, lot to take in. It's okay, I feel the same way. But what's important to me is that I demonstrated a little Python knowledge, I enjoyed overthinking my Xbox collection, and sort of low-key one of the purposes of this video, in kind of collection trimming and maintenance, maybe maintenance is the best word, is that I pulled out a few games from my trade pile prior to our upcoming local game swap meet, so I've got some trade inventory set aside that I didn't think about before. Next time I will pick a different console library, I will take the Python knowledge a few steps farther, maybe approach from a different angle to keep learning new things, and of course I would love to know your thoughts. How do you trim your collection? How do you maintain your collection? If you're a Python person, tell me what I could do differently to improve. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all doing great.